Thank you, sir, and thank you, ma'am. Now, I would like to hand over the session to Ms. Suhasini Haidar. Over to you, ma'am.
Good morning, all. And, as they were talking about some of the stories I've worked on, I was just wondering in my mind, how much of those stories even mean anything to the audience here? Could I just see with a show of hands, how many of you were born after 2000? Okay, I get the sense. Why I ask that? Because in terms of the times we live in, and this is why the subject was chosen to talk about a zeitgeist, a spirit of the times that we live in. What is always important to see is where we have come from. Show me a man's past, and I'll predict his future. Napoleon was once asked about the foreign policy of a country, and he said, show me a country's geography, and I'll tell you everything you need to know about their history and future foreign policy. So I'm going to try to explain to you in this lecture, really, how you need to look at the times, you need to look at the trends, because you are the future leadership of the country and the world. You will need to know what is the zeitgeist of your times, what is the spirit of your time, what is inspiring people to go upwards, and what is keeping them down, what are the challenges that are keeping them down. You might wonder why any of this has anything to do with foreign policy, but that's why I'm here to tell you. So if I was to look over, and of course, your own institution here, REVA University, is as like you, a product of the times after 2000, I think started in 2004. The fact is that our world has changed in ways that we cannot fathom, and you will have even more difficulty fathoming because you were born into the world at this time. You were born into the world in a new millennium. So when I look at you and say, okay, but now I'm going to tell you about the next decade, I'm thinking all of you knew, you knew how to hold a phone when you were probably less than a year old. You knew how to work a computer. You were probably teaching your parents how to use a computer by the time you were 5 or 6 or a little older. So the things that happened at the beginning of the millennium that should continue to inform us for now, that's what I want to talk about first. And once I've done that, I will talk to you about where we see the future trends of foreign policy going. Again, the fact is that no matter where you are, no matter where you work, you are going to need to be connected to what is happening in the world. So if you've got papers and pens, you're most welcome to use them. Actually, in the year 2000, when I used to give lectures, to be honest, I always used a PowerPoint. I've learned over time that I don't use the PowerPoint, but you're most welcome to take down the points. What are the 10 things that happened over the last 2 decades, last 15 to 20 years, that we should really know about and how things have changed since then? So the first thing, I think, that made the world wake up suddenly was the late, maybe 2005, 2006, the big economic financial collapse. It was a global banking collapse. There was a complete slump in the real estate market. It was mostly the Western world that was affected by it, but we saw some of the effects in our part of the world as well. So the first thing that happened was suddenly people started to realize that the mantra we had been coming with from, say, even the 1940s, which was that globalization was the future, that we would produce something in one part of the world, it would be shipped to another part of the world, that part of the world would be working on finance or banking or something else, some other part of the world would be looking at derivatives. That idea began to recede. Now, you might think that's perfectly normal. For my generation that grew up with liberalization and grew up with the idea of globalization, the financial collapse actually made a big difference. It was also the beginning of India's rise in the eyes of the world because India was able to sustain itself through that particular collapse. The second thing that happened, now as globalization began to be seen as a problem, where countries were spending all their money on manufacturing products outside the country and therefore paying much more for them in their own country, there began to be a sense that what people wanted was to air certain, populisms, as they are called, the fear of the other, a certain amount of, feelings against immigrants, a certain sense of majoritarianism in the world. This too began to grow. By 2000, it was very clear that in countries after countries, in democracies, people were voting for those who looked at majoritarian trends much more. So they were already looking at the trends, at how things were moving. They were looking for people who were, in a sense, anti-globalization, anti-immigrant, xenophobic almost. And these were the worrying trends that came out of those first two decades. The third, and this is again something that you should perhaps look at. Today, what is the biggest crisis that we hear about the most in the world? And we saw it in Delhi as well, in Bangalore last week, when the G20 finance ministers met here, the G20 foreign ministers met here, is the war in Ukraine. But if you were to actually go backwards, you would realize that this is not a war in Ukraine that began in 2022. It actually began at that time. And why was that? Again, one big collapse was in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. After that, Russia began to join the Western world. In 2008, however, the seeds were sown for Russia to pull away, uncouple from that Western world, if you like. In 2007, NATO began to say, we want to include more countries close to Russia. In 2008, Russia invaded a part of a neighboring country called Georgia, saying we need to have buffer zones around our country because we are now dealing with Europe. So when people say, my God, everyone was taken by surprise when the war in Ukraine happened, you should tell them, no, it's been happening since 2008. In 2014, when Russia again annexed a part of Ukraine, Crimea, it used the same logic. And in 2022, we saw the same thing. So these are all trends that are coming. First, economic. Second, political. Third, this kind of decoupling between Russia and the West in particular. Fourth, if I mention Russia, then I have to also mention China. The rise of China. Until 2005, 2006, it was actually seen as a very beneficial rise to the world. Because as China grew its manufacturing capacities, it became an extremely important part of the global supply chains and the global economy. However, from 2008, we start to see China's rise in other areas. So they were no longer sufficiently, happy with the rise in economic power, but they also wanted strategic power, also wanted military power of a sort we had not seen before. So we started to see China, for example, renaming parts of its boundary areas. We saw it in India as well, renaming towns on the other side of boundaries that they said are actually ours. So they gave them all Chinese names. We saw it in Arunachal, which caused some of the problems. We also saw China working much more in the South China Sea and doing the same in terms of claiming islands, claiming parts of the ocean that they said had belonged to them. By 2010, China became ready to set up what is called a blue water navy that could ride in the oceans everywhere. In 2013 or 2014, I think China had sent out naval warships, a kind of armada, which were on a peace mission, on a goodwill mission around the world. So these warships were going from country to country, about 100 countries around the world. One of them docked in Malé, in the Maldives. And I remember calling my friend and saying, in Malé, and saying, can you tell me when was the last time a Chinese warship came in to Malé Harbor? And their answer was 500 years ago. So again, we're seeing something happen since all of you were born that has not happened for hundreds of years, right? So this rise of China, leading eventually to the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure all of you read about, became one more part of a new puzzle that was being formed for the world and new ideas that the world had to come to live with, to understand and to find solutions to if necessary. Another part of your generation is terrorism, and then that's an unfortunate part. But it actually maps the rise after 2000 of a time when terrorism went global. Not only were countries cooperating much more in terms of fighting terrorism, but we were seeing terror groups link up much more. A terror group in Syria would have some link with a terror group in Sri Lanka, for example. And we saw this kind of globalization of terror take place. As we get into the 23rd year, I have to say I do think that we're hearing less and less about that global fight, especially after all that has happened in Afghanistan. And the truth is that we are also seeing ourselves driven much, much less by the problems of the past, because we've got so many problems in the present. What are our big problems in the present? And I think Prime Minister Modi said this at the G20 foreign ministers meeting. We have had to deal with the economic collapse. We've had to deal with COVID. We've had to deal with a war that has meant, in its own terms, food, fuel, fertilizer, basic scarcities. So in terms of that, we have seen the shift move away from things like terrorism. What also happened in the 2000s, and now this is a term that all of you are well aware of, I can assure you I grew up not ever having heard of it, and that is climate change. In the 2000s, the world began to recognize that yes, global warming was a thing, that actually climate change was affecting patterns. What was changing? Just 2-3 years ago, 2020 became the hottest year on record in the world, right? So when that kind of heat happens, when that kind of increase in the temperatures happens, what also happens? You suddenly see glacial melts, you see floods like you have never seen before, and after all, last year we saw in South Asia, we saw in Pakistan, but floods in other parts as well. Suddenly you'll see pictures of flooding. Bengaluru's dealt with it as well. And then the more floods then lead to more drought because the water is already out, and that leads to food scarcity. So this is also a new thing that we are dealing with in just the first 2 terms of the millennium. In fact, it was in 2008, about 15 years ago, that countries first came together at a climate change conference in Copenhagen and agreed that we should not allow global warming to be more than 2 degrees. They haven't yet achieved a real path towards that goal, but we're seeing more and more details. So today, when you read about renewable energy projects, or you read about carbon mitigation, these are all subjects for your future. Because when we were growing up or when we were in college, we certainly had never heard of any of these terms. What else happened? So I'm now at number 7. We saw what is called the birth of recommendation technology. How many of you know what that already means? Okay, so recommendation technology is essentially artificial intelligence. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, most. And also works on issues like predicting your preferences. Now that, if you ask me, is one of the big changes we're seeing in the world, right? So our choices today are actually, whether you like it or not, are being guided on a daily basis. When you go and open Netflix on your computer or at home, what does Netflix tell you? It tells you, here's what you'd like to watch. And 9 times out of 10, you are convinced, because who wants to sit and think too much? If I've watched this film and I've liked it, I'll probably like 10 other films that look like it. But you are being guided. Facebook, or what was called originally Face Mash, that was its first term, began just in the new millennium. After that came something like Spotify. And you listen to music now, and you're listening to more music of the kind you already like, because they are predicting for you. The computer is predicting for you what you would like to like. There's a downside to it. I see it in the newspaper business. Now, again, I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you read the news? How many of you get your news from television? Very few. How many of you get your news by reading a newspaper physically? Okay, I'm seeing a few hands. How many of you look at your phone? Okay. So this tells you everything you need to know about where the changes are coming. Is there a problem with that? Not at all. Because eventually these are media. These are ways of getting to the information that you require, and you are now tuned to know how to look for that information. But what is going away is the idea that you might want to see what you don't know anything about. Why, somebody like me who's considerably older still insists on reading a newspaper is because when I turn the page, there are stories I didn't know. Right now, when you go to your whichever web page you look at for news, what you're essentially seeing is the subjects that you already know something about or have an interest in, and then they give you more of that. So somebody like me, for example, will never read a sports website because I'm not that tuned into listening to sports. But if I have a newspaper in my hand, I will also see the sports page as I close it, the back page of the paper. So what I'm trying to tell you over here is that more and more, without your even realizing it, you are being guided by recommendation technology. That's what's telling you what you might be interested in. And then once you show you're interested in that, you're seeing more and more of it. We're nearly at the end of the list. The next one, and this everyone in your generation knows well, but you don't perhaps realize how much your generation has had to deal with it, and that is pandemics. Global pandemics have always been around, but in the last 2 decades, what we have seen is the growth of what is essentially seen as genetically modified viruses, whether it was H5N1, the avian flu, that began in the late 1990s and really carried into the next millennium, or whether it was SARS or MERS, or more recently, of course, COVID, we're seeing the growth of pandemics that are moving very quickly from animals to humans. And that transmission is what should start worrying us. Because the next generation, and that is you, are going to have to factor it into whatever you do. It also marks, these 2 decades mark the beginning of what is called gain-of-function research, where you essentially take a virus, you modify it, and you might be modifying it just for pure research, but you might actually be modifying it to weaponize it. And you modify it and see how it reacts then, and how much more potent that virus becomes then. That research was actually banned for a few years, and then it was unbanned. But I do think now there is a general understanding that that research has to be used very, very, very carefully. After what we have seen in the world, 3 years of a virtual shutdown around the world, your generation grappling with it, many people being pushed out of jobs as a result of it, the whole future of work has changed. Most of us are no longer thinking about being in an office when we work. What does that mean? That changes the entire real estate patterns for the world. Next year, there's a prediction that most leases that were signed before 2019 or before 2020, most of those leases will run out within the next year in terms of office leases. What is that going to do to the future of offices? Are offices going to say, I don't really need to put this money in here anymore? What are the ancillary industries that would be affected? So again, this is a pattern we've seen for the last 2 decades. And again, we're looking at how it will change the future. Number 9, that happened in this century, is India's nuclear deal, if you like, with the United States, which changed a whole bunch of things. The interesting thing is the idea of the India-US civil nuclear deal was, A, to bring more renewable energy for India, but it was to take India out of its isolation and have more American and other countries build nuclear power plants in India. As of today, there are no new nuclear plants in India, as in the only ones that are being made are made by Indians or have been made by the Russians under previous contracts. But India has changed forever. I think all of you would agree that in the last 20 years of the relationship between India and the US changing, India has changed. Our outlooks have changed. The way we look at strategy has changed. The way we look at the future of our jobs has actually become more look west in a sense than before. And that is going to have another impact on your future. We're seeing interesting things happen as a result. You are seeing country after country seeing Indian origin leaders coming to the fore. There's that famous meme now of Rishi Sunak standing with Kamala Harris, where they say, "Jhande unke, lekin bande hamare," which is essentially we own all of these people who have gone out in the world and done something. Today, if the UK and Ireland negotiate their North Ireland Protocol, which they have to for Brexit, they are going to be negotiating between an Indian origin person, Rishi Sunak, and another Indian origin person, which is Leo Varadkar. So we are seeing that entire idea of India being exported around the world, which has been done for decades. But we're seeing that come to the fore in areas we had not seen it before, which is politics. There have always been Indian engineers. It's a prototype. The Simpsons always has an Indian running a convenience store. But what has changed is now the Indians there in the political sphere. And I've come to the end of my list to number 10, which is the rise of the rest. In the year 1999, just before the millennium changed, somebody coined the term BRIC. Does anyone know who that was from? Because it was someone who will be like the future of some of you who go into investment banking and all the rest. But it was Jim O'Neill, who came from Goldman Sachs. And he sort of proposed the theory that the world had so far seen economic growth coming from the developed world as we know it. So the G7, or what was called the G8 in those days, because Russia was a part of it, which were the most developed nations, really represented the bulk of the world's wealth. Today, however, or he made the case in 1999, the case changed because the bulk of the new growth in the world was coming from emerging economies. He actually was the one who proposed the idea of BRICS and said Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Eventually, South Africa was added. He just made it BRICS with a small s. Now, why was that a potent idea? Because it changed the way the world began to look at emerging economies. Yes, you dealt with poverty. Yes, your per capita GDP was much lower than the rest of the world. But suddenly, you were being seen as a potent force because of the size and the speed of your growth. Linked to that was the speed of the population as well. Because if demand and manufacturing require populations, then these were the countries where it was going to come from. Somebody in the West was not going to buy a new dining table every year or whatever it was. But in the East, it was going to grow and grow and grow. So this idea began to grow. And we saw the growth also in 1999 of the idea of the G20. So those of you who are wondering why the excitement about the G20 in India this year, I should actually make the point, this is not the first time the G20 has come to India. In 2002, too, India hosted the G20. But in those days, it was a very different format. It was still looking at financial solutions only. There was no geopolitics attached, so the leaders had not got involved. It was just the finance ministers coming together. In those days, they were coming together to look at ways to mitigate the impact of the previous financial collapse, so the Asian financial collapse as it was known in 1997, and looking for global cooperation around that. Now, suddenly, you saw this group emerge, and as soon as the Western banking financial collapse happened in 2008, you saw the world come together at the leadership level. US President George Bush actually brought all the leaders of the G20 together, and for the first time, they held a summit-level meeting. So in that sequence, since 2008, or I think it was maybe 2008 was the first such summit, we have seen that process grow, and by 2023, India is now hosting it. It is the 17th or the 18th country out of the G20 to host it. And a third grouping also grows at that time. And that was called the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, this is something India only joined in 2017. We'd been observers in 2006. But this was a whole new look at a very different grouping from anything else that India had been a part of. So most of these international agencies, international multilateral organizations, were essentially Western-led. This was led by Russia and China. And suddenly we saw India open up to a whole new type of what is called multi-alignment, because in the old days we talked about non-alignment, aligned with nobody. It changed a little bit into the era of strategic autonomy. It changed a little more into the era of what is called multi-alignment, multipolar alignment. A little more I have written about, half facetiously, is the idea of all alignment, that I can be everything to everyone. Obviously, that does catch up with you. But we are seeing that shift happen. So if those are the 10 big shifts that occurred over the period where all of you were growing up and becoming the people you were before you came into REVA to study, what is it? What is the zeitgeist? What is the sense or spirit of the times that we need to look for in the future? So I'm going to give you only 5. So don't worry about it. But it is important to know just how our geopolitical grammar is now changing, what you need to know for the next decade. The first, unfortunately, divisions and polarization is back. Not since the Second World War have we actually seen this kind of situation where the world is just uncoupling. Over the last year, we have not just seen, after the Russian war invasion in Ukraine, we have not just seen countries uncoupled strategically or even economically. They are uncoupling culturally. If you saw in Germany, the Munich Philharmonic could not keep its orchestra because many of the members from it were Russian. In Canada, I think it was a ballet company that sent all Russian dancers away. In Russia, all foreign media was being verified, and most of them were being shut down or deported or sent out of the country. So we're seeing a very, very deep polarization. If I give you 2 separate websites today, you will get 2 separate versions of how the war in Ukraine is going. If you read today a Western newspaper and you read a Russian newspaper, you'll get the exact opposite idea. So our minds are also now being polarized into depending on what you're reading. For you as managers, what is important is the way the economies are uncoupling. If sanctions against Russia remain, and now look at it this way, at the United Nations, 140 countries or so voted to say, we think what Russia did in Ukraine is wrong. But only 40 countries and less have actually joined the US and European sanctions against. India is one of those. We have not joined the sanctions against. So actually, we've also not voted against Russia at the UN. But there are many, many countries out there. 100 countries, half the world, thinks the invasion is wrong but won't join sanctions. So what does this mean for economies? Because over time, the sanctions will get tighter and tighter if there is no resolution to the war. And history has shown us that you don't back off on sanctions ever, whether it's been the sanctions on North Korea, whether it's been the sanctions on Iran, on Venezuela, on so many other places. It's very rare that you actually back off from those sanctions. So we're going into a world where Russia will be under sanctions, and anyone dealing with them also has to look at an alternate, what they call de-dollarized world, if you like, to engage with each other, especially if China is part of that world. You get immediately half the world economy going in one direction and half the world economy going in another. There were investment bankers who had put a lot of money into Russian bonds, who have suddenly realized that they need to now choose. And most of them have had to just leave and leave all of their funds over there as well. So that's the first, this kind of complete uncoupling of 2 sides of the world. At the G20 last week, we saw it. Russia and China on one side, other countries on another. Eventually, I call it actually the G9 complex. And I know there's a G2, there's a G4, there's a G7, there's a G20. But it's a G9 problem, which is the 7 countries of the developed world, which is basically US, Canada, and European countries, and Japan. And on the other side, you have Russia and China. So if you add up the G7 with with Russia and China, you have 9 countries in the top developing countries of the world that are now fully polarized. So it is up to us in the G11 to forge the world ahead, to find places of consensus, to work ways in which both sides of the world can actually deal with each other. And I don't have to choose between doing business with one half of the world and the other half. The next zeitgeist for the world is the exit of globalization. Actually, it's not just what happened in 2008 that made globalization a bad word, but COVID. COVID has taught us that there are inherent dangers to globalization. Because what was the first thing that happened? Well, the first thing that happened is China shut down Wuhan, but they didn't shut down the industrial area near Wuhan in time. So there were all these business delegates who had gone to a particular, I think, international trade fair outside Wuhan, who then flew back home, including to Italy. So if you remember, Italy had a very, very large problem with COVID. Immediately, the reaction became, let's stop this kind of global trend, simply because the travel will also bring with it problems. So in the old days, if the problems were things like immigration, now it's just a bug coming across and into your country. The second thing that happened with COVID was the shutting down of boundaries. Every country, including India, just shut down its boundaries and said, I will not have people coming from outside. Now, none of it made sense in hindsight, because the truth was you couldn't stop the virus from spreading. And in the long term, it actually shows that no matter how much you shut your country down, like China did, eventually, as soon as you opened it, you dealt with COVID. So the eventual point of all of this was that it was possible for the world to go back to a time where they just closed themselves in. Europe became one unit. US and Canada and parts of Mexico became one unit. But the rest of every part of the world started bunching up. Now, where is that a problem for India? Because even though India has this grand place at the global high table, and obviously hyper-nationalism is not, it's not a sustainable view for the future. Everybody has seen the benefits of globalization, of bilateral trade, of multilateral trade. So we're not going back to that world where we didn't deal with the rest of the world. So what is the world going into much more? So this is your second zeitgeist. And that is a sense of regionalism. When it comes to regionalism, just look around the world. If I had a map of the world right now, I would show you. You have USMCA, that's Mexico, Canada, and America. You have Mercosur, which is the economic union of South America. You have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, all of Africa. You have the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Gulf region. You have the European Union, which, of course, is a unit of its own. You have the Central Asian region that has its own. It's called the Eurasian Economic Union, EEAU. You have RCEP, which is Southeast Asia, Australia, Japan, Korea, China, all part of something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. And then you have India, which is part of South Asia, but because for the last few years, problems between India and Pakistan have derailed the idea of a full South Asian economic union. So we are, in a sense, outliers in this particular zeitgeist. And you need to think about that. Because other things are changing. People are dealing much more in terms of their own region. 62% of trade in Europe happens within European members. How much happens in South Asia? 5%. That's in a good year. The third, and I think these are trends that we see around the world, we see it in India too, and in the rest of the region, and that is populism is defining foreign policy. So in the old days, if the idea was that politicians needed to be popular, today diplomats need to be popular as well. Your foreign policy has to be something that people like. This was not the idea of the past. The idea of the past tended to be do what's in your national interest, but not necessarily something that is popular. That idea has changed today. And with that comes many other ideas. I was listening to the Serbian president speak at a function some weeks ago. And he said in the old days, and this is why I use this particular term, in the old days, men behaved like men and states behaved like states. In other words, men were emotional and sometimes driven by senses of ego, hatred, jealousy, all the rest. But states were supposed to be cool actors. Today he said states are behaving like men. No offense to any of the men in the audience, but the idea that whole states are doing irrational things that are not in their interest. When Russia decides to annex a part of Ukraine, maybe that's in its interest. But how is it in Russia's interest to, say, bomb civilians in the rest of Ukraine? Now, these are what we are seeing. Why is it in China's interest to aggress on the border with India, a country that, frankly, it has every reason to gain from the relationship with, or to aggress against the South China Sea, or the crisis we saw last year in Taiwan? Because states are behaving like men. There are many such examples. In India too we see it, in other countries, where there is a clampdown on NGOs, a clampdown on the media, a clampdown on the opposition. In Turkey, the president stood up in parliament and said, when he was asked a question, he said, "I am the people. Who are you?" So basically, the opposition doesn't count, the media doesn't count, the NGOs don't count. This is defining foreign policy. And that's where it's important for all of you to understand that that is where a lot of the decision-making is coming from. It's not necessarily about data and analytics and what's the best idea. Fourth, Zeitgeist. I've spoken a bit about this, but it is going to change everything that you do. Climate change. Essentially, the scarcities that come from climate change will define us. When we look for renewable energies, when we look to conserve electricity, when we look to conserve flying, adding to the carbon in the atmosphere, when we even look at small things, like how much you water your grass, those are all choices that are going to be made for us by climate change. And so therefore, when you are looking at industries, you will have to look at industries that incentivize renewable technology, that incentivize a transition away from coal and from other non-renewables. In fact, the second part of this only is that data will drive us. Not just the recommendation technology I was talking about, but data in general is going to drive your choices. The more data you have, the less actual energy you have to expend to go forward. So in a sense, it's moving from silicon to lithium. And I know that Bangalore is called India's Silicon Valley, but soon it may also be called India's Lithium Valley, simply because a lot of smart technologies, a lot of semiconductor technologies the R&D is being done here. We're also seeing the push for renewable energies, for renewable grids. The idea that energy itself will grow if you divide it. As in, if you are willing to share it with others, if you are willing to share your renewable energy with others, you will actually be able to produce much more. And that will help if India, for example, also exports renewable energy. It brings it from Nepal, Bhutan, parts of India, and then exports it to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh, and even to Pakistan, if that was to work out. And the fifth zeitgeist, I think, that you have to be prepared for is that multilateral institutions are going away, or certainly losing their relevance. The United Nations has been tried and tested and is failing. Multilateral institutions are failing. We heard the Prime Minister say global governance is failing. You see it with the Ukraine war, where nobody is able to enforce a deterrence so that the war stops. You're seeing it in terms of COVID, where nobody has been held responsible. You can't even get an agreement today when India and South Africa went to the WTO and said, let's at least for the next 3 years put a freeze on patent rights, on COVID, counter-COVID medicines and vaccines. They couldn't get an agreement on it. And by the time that agreement comes, it won't matter because COVID will have moved on to the next pandemic. And actually, we will be looking much more at ourselves creating this technology. The other part of the United Nations that's been said and said again is that it is unrepresentative. If at its best it represents the reality of post-World War II, that reality is nearly 100 years old. It's at least 75 years old already. You cannot have a global body that is run, or whose most powerful organ, the Security Council, is run by countries that have not a single permanent member from South America, Africa, only one member from Asia, none from the Australasian and Pacific area. You cannot have a situation where 3 members come from one continent and there are no members from 3 continents. So eventually you are going to have to build something, replace it, or rebuild it as something more representational. For you, how does that matter? I think what you have to remember is there's an old phrase actually about the United Nations, which says that when a big country and a little country go to war, then the little country goes away. Because it's a big country, little country goes to war, little country no longer exists. Said when 2 small countries go to war, the war goes away. Because 2 small countries can't sustain a war for too long, right? So when it's a big country and a small country, the small country goes away. When it's 2 small countries, the war goes away. But when it is 2 big countries that go to war, then the United Nations goes away. Because as you can see, the moment the conflict becomes about 2 big powers, as it is right now about US and Russia, however you want to look at it, the actual point is that the United Nations no longer seems adequate to deal with that. That is why Russia has been able to veto every statement that criticizes it at the United Nations. America has been able to veto every statement against it at the United Nations, whether it was the Iraq War, whether it was Afghanistan, and all the rest of them. So what will the future look like? If we don't have a United Nations, we will just basically stratify into transactional understandings that every issue will have my interest versus your interest. So the new proposal perhaps could be of something called 50-50-50. 50 countries get together in 50 different combinations for 50 different subjects. So if my subject is climate change, suddenly I find common cause with, say, the developed world, and I want climate justice. And if the other issue is terrorism, I'm dealing with countries that are also affected by terrorism. So on every issue, 50-50-50. The problem really is that 50-50-50 does not bring the world any closer. In fact, it enhances the divides between all of us. So that is the last thought I will leave you with. It's not the most cheerful thought, but the idea that what we've seen of the world and and all that we say about the earth being one family and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is in danger today, or is in peril of going the 50-50-50 way. I'll stop over here, and thanks so much for listening so patiently and quietly, and I'd like to take questions. Yeah, sure. Okay. Can I just see? Does this work?
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, it does work. Can I just see with a show of hands how many of you have questions? Okay, right in the front. Okay, I'll try and come to each of you. Go ahead. Could we get a mic in the front? Yeah. You're here.
Good morning, ma'am. I am Sanjay from second year MBA. I am a little much interested on the 5th point you spoke about. So don't you think that terrorism is a geopolitical game? Because understanding a simple fact that these small groups don't have the ability to get the weapons. So whom are we in war with?
That's an important question, because it is actually about which country is taking on which country with non-conventional means. Essentially, when they help a non-governmental group. Because when 2 states go to war, it's a war. But when one state uses terrorism against another, that's terrorism. That is state-sponsored terrorism. But there is more and more games that go on with terrorism. But what is important to remember, and this is something I've seen in the last few years much more, we saw it with Afghanistan as well, which is that terrorism is no longer being seen as a developed world problem. Actually, as of last year, there were more terror referrals of the terrorism of the sort we have seen. There were more terror referrals on right-wing extremist groups in the United States than there were of jihadist or left-wing extremist groups. So the world goes through all kinds of cycles. We saw left-wing extremism at one point really taking over places. We saw it across South America, saw it in Africa, communist revolutions, which also turned violent. So in terms of those, we have seen the next cycle. The next cycle was the jihadist violence we saw. Groups coming together on the basis of religion, not on the basis of country or nationalism. And now we're seeing a growth in what is called right-wing nationalist terrorism. And that the US has already, sort of made a lot of cases of. New Zealand, we saw them start something called the Christchurch Alliance looking at them. So yes, terrorism is a geopolitical game, but the cycles within it keep changing. Go ahead. Who else has a question?
Ma'am, am I audible? Yes. Keeping your point of view on the economy of the country, as we could see, we have seen many startups coming up from the past 2-3 years. And we have hit many companies who have also been the title of unicorn. And we could say with the proverb that when we could compare the present country's economic condition with the dot-com boom in the 1990s. There are many economical proverbs that we can take, but if you could consider the dot-com boom, just like how the India is growing now, many companies, many people started adapting to the internet. Many companies like Napster and providing utilities, just like we have Blinkit now. There were many companies then who provided pet care needs or something else. And because of the government's regulations, some of the companies, they shut down. And probably Amazon and eBay was the one which rose over there. In the same way with our countries, from after COVID also, we have got many companies like Byju's, EdTech, and Blinkit or many things. They've hit the unicorn title and the investment also. And for now, the companies are booming down. It could be for the investor stake or something as such. So I wanted your perspective for the coming years of the country, because as we could see that we are growing every single minute. It could be from the digitalization world, it could be from the economy, it could be from the present international affairs also. So can you give us your perspective on the present 3-4 years of the economic condition of our country, or how to tackle with the recession and other perspectives too?
What is your name?
My name is Sharan Babu, the first year student.
Okay. Sharan, thanks so much for your question. I have to put the rider that tech is not really my subject. But I do feel very much that the problem you're explaining, which is that the big tech companies tend to still gobble up most of the share, because the smaller unicorns come up and then either get bought out by the big tech companies or are floundering for the next round of investments. I think that's a genuine problem. That is also a problem of any market where there is not that kind of state control or state protection, if you like. You are seeing unicorns being placed out there, having to deal with that international market. I mean, but there are others that do well. A small company like Spotify, Swedish company, is the biggest music aggregator in a sense around the world. So you do see different kinds of businesses do well. It's all about being ahead of the zeitgeist, if you like, about anticipating what people's needs are going to be. When COVID happened, a lot of companies went bust. But the companies that did well were the ones that thought on their feet and said, for example, we need path lab chains. So I don't actually have to build a path lab. I just have to connect people to the closest path lab to them so they can go get tested. Those were the ones that did well. Years ago, I went to Israel, and Israel is known as Startup Nation. Actually, it's before all of us. And I spoke to somebody who helped incubate. And he had himself started a whole bunch of startups. And there were really interesting startups. For example, there was one who took away people's old laptops and repurposed them for Africa. But what they did was essentially say, old laptops nobody's going to use. But each time they handed that laptop over to someone, the company back home won some points. It was called a development index points or something like that. And then they found a way to monetize that. And people were able to trade in development points like you do now with climate change and carbon credits. So it's a question of who's ahead on carbon credits. So I was asking this person who incubates, what is the secret? Why do you think this country has been a startup nation, not others? And he said something very interesting to me. He said, look, to begin with, we're risk takers. If you want to be a unicorn, you have to be a risk taker. There's no other way to do it. You can't say, I want only 10% risk, because then you'll have to do a different business. But he said the second reason we do well is Israel has conscription. I'm not suggesting that. So that all the youth has to go into the army. So he said we're much stronger, more courageous, able to live with much less. We're leaner because we've done military service. But he said the real reason is that there is no stigma, and this was very important. There is zero stigma attached to failure. He said, over here, if you haven't failed at least 2 or 3 times, it means you have no experience. So your CV must actually include your failures. You must be able to say, I failed at this one, but I learned this, and then I did this, you know? And it was a real one of those light bulb moments for me, because his point was that most of our societies are so worried about what people will think of us, or if we fail, or what will my mother tell the neighbors, more like it, if we aren't succeeding in what we do. But he said if you take the stigma of failure away, in fact, make failure a positive thing. Make people put it in their resumes. Make people talk about it. Make people go up on stage and say, I want to tell you how I failed. You're actually going to be able to get more ideas into the system and be more successful. I hope that answered your question. Go ahead. Who else had a question? Right there.
Ma'am, due to change in world order and then rise of new powers, how country like India can take a leadership position for developing countries and keep their interest on priority rather being a bully like West, ma'am?
Very interesting. And this is, again, a zeitgeist of the moment, right? We're talking about being the voice of the global south. We're talking about India being the voice for the voiceless of the developing world at a platform, at the G20, where most of the countries are, you know, in the upper echelons of the developing world and the developed world. So this is a choice that we all have to think about a little bit, because we're all very excited about the idea of India being at the high table, of India being amongst the most powerful countries in the world. The point is, how is that power helping the Indian? How is it helping the poorest Indian? How is it helping those who have the least? That's the important thing, that India as a power at the top of the world is important so long as it is actually empowering its poorest, empowering its bottom 1/3. And that's the difference between others. So that's one place. The second place where India's role in terms of being the voice for the voiceless is in terms of what I said, scarcity of resources are the future. Who created the climate change impact on the world today? The developed world. The richest countries are rich today because they grew on coal at rates much faster than the rest of the world. So who needs to pay for it? The developed world. That's the whole concept of climate justice. And they had some kind of an agreement at the COP28 conference in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, and they're hoping to build on that. Now, over there, it's important that India becomes a voice for all these countries, because obviously we have the size, we have the ability to understand the problems. You know, the 25%, I think, of climate change impact happens in South Asia. A bulk, I think the maximum number of cyclones that have occurred in the last 25 years have occurred in South Asia, Bay of Bengal, Arabian Sea. And more than anything else, it is in South Asia that we are seeing 9 out of 10 of the world's most polluted cities. So with climate change, with pollution, these are issues where India is not just in a position to help, but is in the position that needs the most help. And I think it's important to take a collective version. Pollution, for example, air pollution cannot be fought by a country alone. No country has done it. It can only be fought by what is called the protection of airsheds. Now, it so happens that our airshed goes from Pakistan all the way to Bangladesh and a bit of Myanmar as well. So we're going to have to work with other countries in South Asia. And that's actually my third point, that we are going to have to work out some kind of a South Asian consensus or compact in order to move forward with the world. And I think finally, where India needs to understand that its voice is important is because of its own diversity. I say this again and again because if you look at the rest of the world, there is only one country of the size of India, of the population of India, because there are countries like Brazil that are about as big, or if not bigger, but of the population of India, of the diversity of India, of the plurality of India, which is still a democracy. So that is India's USP. If we stop being any one of these things, we lose our USP. We become either a China or a Central Asian country or one of the others. So these are areas where I do think India can lead the global South and hopefully take a position, as you said, and I really appreciate your question, take a position in the world where we don't end up just becoming like the rest, like bullies.
Students, there can be one last question.
Did you have a question as well? We can take two if you like. Okay, go ahead, go ahead. Okay, you need a mic. And tell me your name when you start. Okay. Interesting. And you said your name was? Manisha said, what is my idea on the rupee being on its way to become a global currency? To start with, it's important, but I think we cannot tie our nationalism up with the currency and with everything else, because eventually markets go up and down. What is changing everything? Why is the rupee now being talked about much more? Because of the digital part of it. Because the world is getting connected in ways that you cannot imagine. In the old days, we went to a bank and we opened an account. Today, we do everything online. Similarly, in the region, we're seeing the rupee being seen as a national currency for trade in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal. And the third place we're seeing a lot more of that is when you are dealing with sanctions, where if every country is allowed to use their own national currency as opposed to the dollar, you would actually see the rupee strengthen quite a lot because of all the trade we do. I definitely think those are all great ideas. I don't think, however, that it is necessary. And sometimes we tend to make it about, the Indian rupee being almost like the national flag or something, which is not necessary. Economies can do very well. They can provide enough growth for their people without ever having a strong currency.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay. There was one last, was there a lady over there who had a question? Oh, a gentleman, yeah. Let's just take that last question. Go ahead.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Maurya GR from second year MBA. Ma'am, my question was, what does it take to be Miss Suhasini Haidar in terms of the pressure, the threats, and other problems that you face in your field of work till now?
Well, thank you for that question. I think each of us is unique. One of the things that keeps me going is audiences like yours. Because I see how interested people are in understanding issues ab initio. They're not interested in somebody's opinion. They're interested in making their own opinion on the basis of facts. And that's the most important thing. I can't give you any life lessons simply because, honestly, your generation is dealing with a whole new world out there. Things I could tell you that we did, you wouldn't need to do. We used to have to get in a car, go somewhere, look at a telex machine, send a message via, that kind of thing, which none of you have to do. You just have to look at your phone and you've got everything going. I do this show once a week, which is done off a cell phone. And I get pretty much great feedback regardless of the fact that, the technology is now not important as much. The only things I would say for your generation, which I'm not generalizing, I'm sure a lot of you do this, is there are 3 basic habits that you must inculcate. The first habit is to read. Please do read. It doesn't matter if you're reading off your cell phone or if you're reading off a laptop or a Kindle or whatever else, but the habit of reading must be there. The more you read, the better you will speak, the better you will write. It cannot happen any other way. The less you read, the less you know. The more you speak, the less you know. So you see, it's all about exit, incoming, incoming files and outgoing files. The more incoming files you have, the more substance to your outgoing files. The second is try and learn a language. It is so important in our world where language means everything. Most of us will speak English, most of us will speak Hindi, some of us will speak a third language, but try to learn a language if you can. And the third, honestly, travel the world. I'm going to ask you one last poll around the audience. How many of you have traveled the world? Have you traveled outside India? Okay, I see a few hands up. How many of you have traveled to one of India's neighbors? Okay. And how many out of all of you have actually taken a boat or walked across a land boundary with one of our neighbors? You see? In audience after audience, think about it. We go through our entire lives without knowing what countries lie at our peripheries. Nobody goes to Bangladesh. Nobody goes to Bhutan. Nepal, you might all go because, Kathmandu is closer. Sorry, I didn't catch that. But at the end of the day, unless you know where you are situated, it is very difficult then. It's so easy for everyone. We have Dubai on one side and Singapore on the other. You have the United States on one side and you have East Asia on the other. Those are all countries everybody will talk about or read about. But your own neighborhood, where you are, as I said, tell me somebody's geography and I'll tell you everything you need to know about their history and foreign policy. So I would say that is my third bit of advice, is travel, but particularly travel in your own region.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for your deeply impressing and the importance of this project. It has gained much traction in our minds since your session. Thank you for spending your valuable time and providing us with a beautiful insight regarding the current scenarios. Now, I welcome our Honorable Chancellor to put forward his view about today's lectures. Please, sir.
Frankly speaking, I have not visited our neighboring countries. That is what Madam told. Few, of course, I have visited, not all. Particularly MBA students. Tomorrow you are going to become administrators. You have to explore the world. You will know what is happening. I have learned a lot by hearing her. Even though I have traveled most of the countries, still I learned a lot with her interaction in my chamber as well as here. We are fortunate to have her here. At the same time, this batch is lucky enough that Dr. Shubha is implementing what I was expecting from last 5 years. That is, students should be exposed for this type of lectures And for other courses, hands-on experience, project-based learning. That is what happening. Anyway, how much you have learned, how you people will use this distinguished lecture series, what you have learned in your life, as well as you are the future citizens and you have to implement those things and also share your thoughts and what you have learned here with your friends and everybody. That. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, madam, for having you here. And definitely, our children are very smart. They will use whatever you spoke here about neighboring countries. They will insist the dean, that is Dr. Shubha, we want to go and visit. This is what their demand will come. Anyway, unless the demand is there, we cannot explore, So we can, right, what is that? Facilitate at their cost, right? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would like to call our Dean, Dr. Shubha A., on stage to brief us about student ambassadorship.
Without wasting much of everybody's time, I would like to just brief few things, and before I go to the topic of student ambassadors, RBS Distinguished Lecture Series, of course, maybe the 13th lecture we are listening today. We have both our first-year students and second-year students here. The other day I was discussing with Professor Raghavendra Prasad Shetty about this Distinguished Lecture Series and the kind of coordination that it requires, and probably inviting right people, having them here on campus, and whether it is giving the topic, finalizing the topic, or whether it is coordination, it is not an easy joke at all. And we have had extremely good speakers here. I think what we cannot learn with the curriculum, because curriculum confines us only with few things. And here we have heard many lectures. Probably when I was doing my MBA, maybe I did not get this kind of exposure, but today, learning never stops. There's no age for learning. Each one of us sitting here are getting lot of inputs, lot of notes I do write. I write it down particularly because certain things I'm able to write down here. Certain things I go back and do read and also try to understand that. That is important. I've always watched ma'am's talk, and she's as graceful. And what I learned from each one of them is probably during my breakfast interaction, lunch interaction with them is many things. It is not only the lecture that they deliver here, but I think it also helps us in grooming ourselves personally. So it is a greatest exposure that each one of you are getting. Probably you should have the awareness about the exposure that you have, and how best you utilize all these things in your day-to-day life is something that is important. Of course, our Pro-Chancellor, Shri Umesh Raju sir, in one of the meeting where I was not there in that meeting, they were having a meeting and they discussed we should have student ambassadors, usually in abroad, I think in different universities. When somebody visits those universities, they have somebody called as student ambassadors who receive the guests and take them around the campus. They talk about the university, they talk about the various programs, the activities and other things. So when this concept was discussed in that meeting, he proposed that this thing should be taken up in our university, and RBS should do, REVA Business School should initiate this particular thing. And Chancellor sir informed me that, see, I want student ambassadors from REVA Business School, and I want them to be as an example. We can just tell the other schools in the university that, see, we have ambassadors here at RBS who are doing all these things, and they should be an example to the other students in the university. Of course, I made a note of it, and then when I came back and I was discussing with my colleague Raghavendra Prasad Shetty, and I also discussed with Professor Evan that we have to do something like this. First, we discussed how we should take it forward. We had 31 students whom we selected for this. And you might be observing all our events, all our programs are coordinated by students. I think more than 16 years, I never sat in the audience. From the time I joined REVA, 16 years, always I used to be backstage coordinating, and that anxiety problem early in the morning whether things will go well. But now I have stopped. Just we facilitate them, and everything is taken care by students. I don't want my colleagues to run around, because it is a platform for students. They do it right or they do it wrong, but they learn from it. And I must tell that last night, 2 of our students, girls, they were in the guest house. They received ma'am. They came at 6 o'clock. They stayed there. They received ma'am in the night, and they were with her. They were coordinating, bringing Chancellor Sir here, escorting, giving all information about the university and other things. I must say in this initiative, I have got tremendous support from Professor Raghavendra Prasad Shetty and also Professor Evin, who supported me, students with whom we discussed about this and who supported. Last night, 9 o'clock, I went to their room in guest house, and I spoke to those 2 girls. They were very happy. They, in fact, sat with me and told me that, ma'am, yes, this is the kind of learning we are getting, exposure we are getting. We are getting so many things over here. They were very happy with the distinguished lecture series. So many questions they asked me, and also related to women. How do we balance our life? So many things they discussed. I think this kind of learning will not happen in the classrooms. I think having student ambassadors, we have 30 ambassadors sitting in the audience, and I can't call all 31 students over here, but yes, 2 of the students who did the MC today, I request Ms. Suhasini ma'am and Chancellor Sir to come over on the stage and hand over the student ambassador ID cards to them. Of course, all of you will get, the student ambassadors will get a different identity card, because it is important we tell everybody that we are student ambassadors very proudly, and we are from REVA Business School, REVA University. Don't forget REVA University, REVA Business School, REVA University. And here we learn many things. This is what we should be telling all others and also inspiring them. Request both of you to come and give the ID cards. Can we have both the MCs on the stage? Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, sir. And we will have one photo session with all the student ambassadors. Probably after this event, I request all of you to please assemble in front of the RBS block so that we have a proper photograph, because it might not be possible here on the stage. Not only that, I would like to also mention about RBS PLS, that is Parichai Lecture Series. The first one will start from 9th, and of course DLS is bringing in people from various fields, eminent speakers who have achieved many things in their life, professionally, personally. They are an inspiration to all of us. Parichai is all about people from industry. So I think we will have the first one. We are also coming up with RBS Wireless, that is the Young Leadership Series. So these 3 initiatives we have started, and I think we should be doing well, giving exposure to all our students, and many more things we will initiate in the interest of the student community. In all this, I must specially thank my colleague who has stood by me, because whether it is 12 o'clock, 12:30, 12:45, or 1 o'clock, he is continuously coordinating, keeping me informed. Sometimes it is difficult because alone I may not be able to do. I need a good team, and I'm backed with a good team. I always take pride in my team and also students, and I never give up on that, because team building is very important. If we have good team, I think great things can be done by us. So thank you all. I request the MCs to take over.
Thank you, ma'am. First and foremost, we would like to thank our beloved Chancellor for his continued support. Thank you, sir. We also take this We also take this opportunity to thank today's distinguished speaker, Ms. Suhasini Haidar, for her time and valuable insights. Thank you, ma'am. It was an honor for us to be a part of this session. I deeply thank our faculty members and the students of REVA Business School for their cooperation and active participation. Thank you, one and all.